Okay, so now we are going to start checking lexical approach. With lexical approach, as its name says, you are going to review lexical content, but it's not only isolated expressions. In fact, those expressions have also a grammatical content. In other words, let's say that your unit is about memories, past memories. So the content that you are going to teach within the lexical syllabus is expressions for activities in the past. And then you may say last, this is the base, week, year, month, another expression, the base expression, previous, and then also year, month, week. So what's the intention of showing this kind of arrangement? That students can visualize that there are different combinations, different possibilities to make combinations, like last week or last month. However, each combination represents a different meaning. Then another topic. Imagine that now we are going to talk about daily routines, and then you may create the I have, and then you have the options dinner, lunch, breakfast, at, and then you have different hours. Again, the purpose is that students can see that they can combine I have lunch at 12 p.m. I have dinner at 9 p.m. I have breakfast at 6 a.m. So in this way, your students are going to visualize that the use of language is just as a matter of combining some elements. In this case, those elements receive within the lexical approach the term of lexical chunks. You see, that's the idea behind lexical approach. The origin of lexical approach was created by Lewis and Willis, and the idea of creating lexical approach was a reaction to traditional structural syllabus. Remember that the communicative language teaching, despite of focusing on competencies like grammar, sociolinguistic, pragmatic, and strategic, in fact, all the arrangement of the topics were around a grammatical aspect. That was in the communicative language teaching approach, everything goes around the notional functional ideas. So, with the communicative language approach, it was like the function of the language, express daily routines, notions of the language, simple present for routinary activities, a conjugation of verbs for routinary activities. That is notions of the language with the function of expressing daily routines. However, with the lexical approach, instead of those notions, functions of the language, you are going to say expressions used for daily routines. And then you are going to classify those expressions, now habitual actions, probably questions about routines. And then with the questions, you may say, do you, oh, bueno, what time do you, yeah, have breakfast, have lunch, have dinner? And then the idea is, again, the students make those combinations. And then with the other expressions for daily routines, I have lunch at, and then with those elements, with those language chunks, in fact, you may give chance your students to create their own dialogues, or the other way around. They're going to see a dialogue model, identify the chunks, and later they will create a dialogue similar to the one they see by making combinations with different chunks. So the fundamental principle of lexical approach is that grammar plays a subordinate role to lexis. In other words, you are going to lexicalize grammar content. Then, with lexical approach, you need to bear in mind that error is intrinsic to the learning process, and sociolinguistic and communicative competence precedes grammatical competence. In other words, when you are teaching those phrases those expressions, you are going to focus. This is a context in which you are going to use it, and then you are going to sound natural if you use this kind of pattern arrangement. And later, obviously, if there exist some doubts, you may add, well, this is the grammar side of those expressions, but not the other way around. Instead of just going directly with the grammar explanation, you go with the lexical aspect. And just if there are some doubts, some questions, you may go with the grammar aspect. So, as a definition of lexical approach derived from the belief that building blocks of language, lexical chunks, and communication are not grammar, functions, notions, or some other unit of planning and teaching, but lexis, in other words, and word combinations. So language is considered to comprise prefabricated expressions and phrases, usually referred as lexical units or lexical chunks, or grammaticalized lexis. This is a definition of lexical units or chunks. They vary in terms of fixedness and in terms of compositionality. Fixedness is like the fixed expressions, by and large. This is one expression, and it's not going to change. And compositionality, for instance, the arrangement of I have, breakfast, lunch, and whatever, because they may have different combinations. And the lexical approach focuses on multi-word items, that is also known as lexical chunks. And these are some types of chunks according to Lewis. There are four basic types: words, the classical, no? Collocations, fixed expressions, and semi-fixed expressions. Fixed expressions such as surf the web, fall in line, fall in love. Collocations, it's like some words that go hand in hand. For instance, make your bed, no do your bed. Make breakfast, no do breakfast. Those are kind of collocations. And that's also the purpose of teaching that kind of lexical units, so students get familiar with them. And these are more examples of lexical units. They also include idioms. Idioms, in fact, are also lexical units because as a whole, they have a full meaning. And this is another strategy you may use to teach, for instance, when you are emphasizing the grammatical aspect of making questions with simple present or simple past. Because the traditional question is, teacher, what does this mean in the question? What does do or does mean in the question? And then you say, well, it's a word that it doesn't represent a meaning, but it's something that you need to use. So in order to a little more or less avoid that uncomfortable question, you may say, this is a fixed expression learned by heart like that. And how you are going to proceed a lexical approach in your classes, in your lessons. First of all, you are going to present the list of chunks. But before presenting the list of chunks, you are going to have like a written text or a conversation model. From that, you are going to extract those chunks. You are going to categorize them by functions, for instance, but as a whole entity. After that presentation of chunks, then you are going to give intensive practice, probably a gap fill text, and students need to fill in with the chunks they are missing. Or you may ask students to create a different combinations with the chunks you presented. Later, as time goes by and lessons carry on, chunks will be accumulated. And as a matter of fact, accumulation will give chance students to later express and use those chunks in more creative activities, such as a composition or an oral presentation in which they need to give probably a description or just like presentation or a specific topic, and then the only requirement is that they use as many chunks as possible. And then finally, you are going to test to check if they have memorized, understood, and probably if they are able to apply those chunks within probably a test, or also when you are asking them to create that conversation or written text. More or less, that is something related to the lexical approach. And I don't know if you have something to comment on the lexical approach.
The logical approach, I don't know. Well, I think it could work for example, for beginners that people who don't it relate with the language to understand or try to start to learn. But I don't know if that it could also work in other levels.
Well, it depends. Probably not as the main teaching approach, but you can take advantage of some strategies for teaching collocations, idioms with upper, intermediate, and advanced students. So they focus on the context, meaning, the use of those expressions, and then feel confident of the, if we can say, the appropriate contextual clues that may lead them to use adequately. So not as a main approach for teaching, but as a techniques. Okay, thank you so much. Danny, now Ingrid, something to add?
Mm, I noticed that my students learn vocabulary better when I play with them. We learn about well on the presentations about holidays. Each team brings something about that holiday. Some groups bring a pumpkin pie, others having a turkey, others fireworks, but fake, of course. Others a group of beer, I guess, and candies and things like that. And it was not a common presentation. They had to act the festivity. It was like an exhibition, and I was supposed to be a tourist that visits United States, and they had to let me know how do they celebrate those uh, festivities, and they really enjoyed the activity. And the next day, we studied the vocabulary, and they remembered the vocabulary because of the role that they were playing, not because they were writing or something. And I think it's more effective than just a dictation or a PowerPoint presentation and things like that. They enjoy to play. Al menos eso he notado. Cuando les pongo presentaciones de PowerPoint de vocabulario, no les prestan atención. Y en esta ocasión que expusieron y actuaron como tal la festividad, se les quedó el vocabulario solito así, de una sola vez. Porque se acordaban lo que hizo el compañero con la cerveza, o la compañera con el baile, y se les quedó.
Sí, porque estaba juntando a la vez el elemento visual, el elemento kinestésico y a la vez el elemento léxico. Entonces el elemento léxico se quedaba mejor por la combinación del elemento visual y el kinestésico. Y eso que nos está dando a entender que el lexical approach no nada más consiste en hacer justamente esa categorización de frases, sino que también requiere justamente combinar algunas otras estrategias que involucren de otros, ahora sí, algunas otras estrategias que involucran conceptos de otros enfoques o métodos, como el del Total Physical Response, que sería justamente el movimiento corporal, en este caso la actuación de los estudiantes, y por su parte también ese otro elemento visual que podría también retomar como una de las técnicas del método directo, en donde a través del uso de objetos reales o cuasi reales pueden también asimilar mejor, en este caso, el contenido léxico. Qué bueno que se está llegando a esa parte en donde están viendo que de todos estos elementos teóricos, no se puede nada más cazar la idea de, con un solo enfoque o método voy a enseñar toda la clase. En realidad son técnicas, principios de cada uno de estos enfoques o métodos que nos van sirviendo para el desarrollo de una clase de lengua, acorde a gustos, intereses, necesidades y a veces también características del propio profe. Por ejemplo, si tampoco contáramos nosotros con mucha disposición de estar realizando esta serie de actividades kinestésicas, también nosotros podríamos estar cayendo en esa disyuntiva de no me gusta, pero es necesario, entonces, ¿cómo lo puedo hacer de mejor manera? Recurro justamente a estas nociones y de ahí entonces me puedo inspirar para poder intentarlo hacer durante la clase. Y ahí es en donde también me puedo dar cuenta de, pensaba en un principio que no me gustaba tanto las actividades que involucraran muchos elementos kinestésicos, pero veo que les ha funcionado e incluso de paso también hasta me están a mí entreteniendo. Me permite también como profe disfrutar parte de lo que estoy haciendo en mi docencia. Muy bien. Someone else who would like to add for the lexical approach? Nope. All right. So this is the presentation of the lexical approach.